morning to all. My name is Frank Reedy, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOW. Today, we're pleased to present a distinguished speaker, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOW network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have questions after this session, email thinkjsow@socom.mil. Since unsettled weather is always a possibility, if you lose connection, just rejoin the session. If the internet fails you, you can always dial in with the phone numbers on your registration email. Today's moderator is Mr. Kyle Garland, a senior faculty here at the Joint Special Operations University. He will introduce the program and today's guest.
Thank you, Mr. Reedy. Hello and good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland, and I'm from the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOW. Think JSOW is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOW faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. As always, I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOW collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the All Partner Access Network, or APAN, and also available for streaming through our library and our JSOW social media sites. For our online attendees today, if you have a question for our guest, please submit the question using the Q&A icon on your toolbar. Today we are honored to have Dr. Eliot A. Cohen join us for a conversation on national security strategy, which will also include his book titled The Big Stick: The Limits of Soft Power and the Necessity of Military Force. Dean Cohen's book was selected by the USSOCOM commander for the 2020 Commander's Reading List as part of the Strategy and War Collection. Dean Cohen is an American political scientist and author. He was a counselor in the United States Department of State under Condoleezza Rice from 2007 to 2009. In 2019, Dean Cohen was named Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, at Johns Hopkins University. Before his time as Dean, he directed the Strategic Studies program at SAIS. Dean Cohen is also a contributing author at The Atlantic and has written extensively on U.S. national security strategy. Dean Cohen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you.
Well, sir, your recent book, The Big Stick, it's about the relationship between military power and American foreign policy. In it, you argue that hard power remains essential for American foreign policy, but while acknowledging that the U.S. military that the United States must be careful about why, when, and how it uses force, you insist that the U.S. international role is as crucial now as ever, and armed forces is vital to that role. So, sir, I'd like to begin our conversation by discussing your book, and I usually like to begin with a question that sort of helps define our topic. So, sir, my first question for you is, will you please describe to our listeners the instruments of hard power that the U.S. is able to wield and how they differ from soft power, and also describe the process our nation should use before doing so?
Sure, I'll be happy to do that. I'm not sure that there'll be things in that part that are really unfamiliar to anybody who's listening to me. But before I go on, though, I have a shout out to Lieutenant Frankie Bridges from Lieutenant Becky Cohen, who is coming back from Rhoda after a couple of years away this weekend. So hi, Frankie. Look, for me, the distinguishing feature of hard power is that it is about the ability to use force, and that's destructive force, things that destroy material or ultimately kill human beings. And that is fundamentally different than some of the other tools of statecraft, which can be unpleasant and can be coercive, but don't really do those things. And there is something that is fundamentally distinguishing about violence. Now, there are some gray edges, I suppose, particularly when you're talking about things like cyber, but it's the destructive quality of hard power. And of course, the United States has many different kinds, from nuclear weapons down to the kinds of things that special operators do. So it's a very wide palette of military force that political and military leaders look at. I can describe what the processes are usually. I mean, the truth is this administration is unusual in the way it's approached its decision-making. But the fundamental fact is every president gets to shape decision-making the way he wants to. But still, the United States has a pretty elaborate national security decision-making structure that flows into what's known as the National Security Council system, with a nested level of committees going up to the Deputies Committee, which is what I served on when I was counselor of the State Department. The principals were the cabinet secretaries, rather, and then, of course, ultimately the president, maybe with the whole panoply of the National Security Council. Now, sometimes decisions get made quite quickly, and so a lot of the formal process gets short-circuited. But I think the one point that I would put out there is, you know, having a really good national security decision-making process doesn't guarantee that you won't make mistakes. Far from it. Having a poor process makes it much more likely that you will. And, you know, and ideally what you have is people making the case for and against certain uses of force, thinking about what some of the longer term consequences are. And then the rather small staff of the NSC has the very important role, which is sometimes overlooked, of monitoring implementation. And maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit more afterwards. It's a lot easier to make the decision to use force than to follow up on implementation and ask, well, did we achieve what we were trying to achieve?
Yes, sir. I'm sort of glad that you mentioned the committee process as it leads up to the National Security Council. Just as a short story, I not so fondly remember running the halls of the Pentagon trying to get papers up to the chairman because he was, or the deputy, because they were going to sit on the deputies committee or the principals committee. So yes, we are part of the decision-making process. So thank you for that. Your book was published in 2016, and in the first part of your book, you address whether the expense of the blood and treasure for the previous 15 years of conflict. And I'm wondering if you would like to discuss this topic and address what are the essential lessons that we learned for future US policy from that same time period.
So, you know, the first question is very, very difficult to answer because for the first reason is you never know what the alternative history would have been. So if you take the most controversial case, namely Iraq, you know, would the world that we would have been living in absent the Iraq war would have been a war where that regime kind of crumbled or went away and you got something better? Or is it one where Saddam Hussein restarts his various WMD programs, which is what he intended to do? You know, would there have been another Iran-Iraq war? You really don't know. The second reason why it's very hard to answer that question, and I will try to answer it, I just want to make it clear the difficulties you run into. You know, history is not like some tape that's out there and it's just, you haven't, you know, things had to be a certain way. Even once a decision to use force is made, there are a lot of contingent events and things depend on, you know, who's the commander and on what decisions you make. And I think that's, as we reflect on these last 15 years, almost 20 years now.
Right.
Really, really important to understand. There are a lot of decisions along the way. There are a lot of different individuals who get involved. There are a lot of different branch points. And I think one of the mistakes we need to avoid is thinking that everything that happened was predetermined, because it never is. And it certainly wasn't in that case. Final thing I would say is, this is hard to grapple with because there's kind of the broader strategic calculations, which are somewhat bloodless and cold and abstract. And there are the realities of, kids left without fathers or mothers, or people permanently mutilated in body or mind by what they've been through. And look, it would have been hard to look into the eyes of a grieving mother after D-Day and say, yeah, it was all worth it. Because from her point of view, it probably wasn't. So having said all that, I think here's my kind of more direct response. After 9/11, there was no question that we were going to end up waging the kind of war in the shadows against Al-Qaeda that and similar movements that we've been doing ever since, which gets waged in a global context in Africa, in Yemen, of course, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places. That was inevitable. I think the Afghan war had a somewhat similar quality. I think after the attacks on the United States, there was no question the United States was going to go after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Once you're in Afghanistan, you weren't simply going to walk away from it for a whole bunch of reasons. Partly because you didn't want Al-Qaeda to grow back, but partly because of the extent to which that would completely destabilize the region. How we approached Afghanistan thereafter, what our goals were, and so on, that is, you can imagine, variance. The really optional war was Iraq. And one of the things I say in the book, and I'd been in favor of the war, is that in retrospect, it was a mistake. And I don't think that's actually, that shouldn't be too controversial a statement, given that, one of the main premises, not the only premise, but one of the main premises about the nuclear program turns out to be false. Now, having said that, I think it would also be a mistake to think that there weren't some important achievements that came out of the Iraq War. And I also think it's a mistake to think that we had to go down the road we went. And in the book, I talk about what are some of the large errors that we made. In terms of the broader lessons, I think that really speaks, but particularly for a professional military audience. The temptation is simply to have the argument, should we have done it or shouldn't we have done it? And that's a perfectly legitimate and important argument. But there needs to be a very serious professional look at how we did it and could we have had different outcomes. And some of that gets to the areas of technical expertise, which we expect of a professional military. I'll give you just one example. So even before I became counselor, when I was serving on the Defense Policy Board, I actually spent a fair amount of time in Iraq. And one of the things that really struck me is the way we ran our unit rotation policies, where instead of planting divisional flags and doing individual rotations of staff, we rotated entire divisional headquarters. And you just, particularly if you went to that country over a period of, I guess I was doing it over 6 years, all told, you saw the disruption that caused, where it made it very hard to have consistent campaign plans. You had commanders and staffs who lost situational awareness because you were rotating the entire command team all at once. And it wasn't necessary. And I think that was something of a self-inflicted wound. And there are others, the way we did procurement. So, I talk a little bit about the story of the MRAP. You got to ask yourself, well, why weren't those things out in the field a lot earlier? Why did it take Bob Gates blowing his stack about the number of casualties? So I think that's the kind of narrower set of lessons that I don't think we've digested, because I don't think we really particularly want to look at them very closely.
Yeah. Well, sir, my next question is, it's a rather large question because it covers a great deal of your book. But in your book, The Big Stick, you dedicate a chapter each to 4 main challenges where military power is a component of the overall response.
Right.
So, sir, I'm going to ask you for our audience if you'll describe each of those 4 challenges and the role the military plays in each.
Sure. So there are basically 4 broad strategic challenges, it seems to me. And in this respect, as I think I said to you before we began speaking, authors usually don't like to reread their books because you begin wincing at the things you said. And I had a somewhat more pleasant experience than I had expected because I reread the book to get ready for this discussion, and I think actually the analysis holds up reasonably well. So basically, I say there are 4 main strategic challenges. One is China, which is a qualitatively different kind of challenge than really anything we've faced since, certainly since World War II. It's quite different from the Cold War challenge. Second set of challenges is the remaining conflict against different kinds of jihadist elements, so Al-Qaeda and analogous movements. The third is what I call dangerous states. They're not necessarily rogues, but states which are looking to recast certainly their regions in ways that are unfavorable to us, that are willing to use force, usually at the subconventional level. And here I'm thinking of Russia, Iran, and North Korea. But I think we may, before too long, find other states in that category, including some that have been allies, like you can even imagine, depending on the trajectory of US-Turkish relations, they will begin to think about Turkey that way. I don't think we're quite there yet, but it could happen. So that's a third set of challenges. The fourth set of challenges is, I borrow a phrase from the great naval thinker Alfred Thayer Mahan, it's the great commons, the ungoverned spaces. And that can be literally ungoverned or only semi-governed places on Earth where government is essentially broken down and has been replaced by much less formal kinds of arrangements. It of course means the oceans, it means outer space, and it means cyberspace. Now, in each of those, it seems to me military power has a role to play. One of the key points of the book, though, is it's different kinds of military power in different ways against each of those challenges, and more subtly, and I think this is particularly something for the professional military education establishment to think about, they require different modes of strategic thought. So, for example, if you think about the contest with Al-Qaeda and analogous movements, that is a long, long war. That's a multi-generational war. It's a war that'll probably go on at a low level, with little spikes here and there for decades and decades and decades. We have to learn to think about strategy in that context. China is a much more traditional kind of conflict. And there we're going to have to, if you look particularly where we are right now, you have to do some pretty serious conventional kinds of thinking about, for example, conflict over Taiwan. There's an article just out in Foreign Affairs saying by a fairly, I would say a pretty moderate former director of the policy planning staff of the State Department, Richard Haas, saying we have to make an explicit commitment that if the Chinese try to take Taiwan by force, the United States will go to war over that. And it's implicit in pretty much everything we've said thus far. But that's a very dramatic statement by somebody who is not normally a bellicose individual at all. And that's kind of conventional military thinking, and so on. And I think that what that suggests is that at the higher level, the intellectual challenge for servicemen and women in the future is really going to be extremely complex. It makes it very interesting, but I think we need to understand that we're going to be dealing with multiple strategic challenges here.
Right. Well, sir, in your concluding chapter, you describe how the U.S. government should think and use, as you call it, the software and hardware of military force. And you've already sort of touched on this question when we talked about the national security, this national decision-making process, but I'd like to ask you if you have anything else you'd like to add. Can you describe this thought process on how the U.S. government should use the, quote, software and hardware of military force?
Well, with regard to hardware, you know, I am not a procurement guy, but I think it's, you know, most people would say, look, there is something that's fundamentally kind of stodgy and slow and problematic about how we acquire military capabilities. And, you know, the special operations community, partly because of its unique authorities, but partly because of its size and its history and its culture, is better than, I think, a lot of the other, but, you know, of the services in some cases. But basically, here the watchword has to be agility, because it's so clear that we're in an extremely uncertain environment. And, you know, I think there's some very promising signs. So, for example, General Berger, with his vision for the Marine Corps, is actually he's a great example for what the services can do. One of the things that I touch on a bit in the book, and if I were to do the book again, which I won't, I would emphasize, is more creative thinking about mobilization. Mobilization, not in the sense of calling up armies of millions of men and women, the way we did in World War II, but mobilization in the sense of tapping the enormous human and technological strengths of the United States to meet particular challenges. You know, the mobilization paradigm is the traditional American paradigm for thinking about military power, and we got away from that basically in the middle of the 20th century, after, I would say, probably the 1950s. And in some ways, we need to go back to it. And we missed opportunities to draw on the strengths of American society during particularly the Iraq and Iran and Afghan wars. We should be thinking about what are the ways in which we can very quickly do that going forward, the way people thought in the 20s and 30s. The other big thing is the investment in intellectual capital. And that's why, it's one of the reasons why whenever I'm asked to speak to a military academic audience, my default answer is yes. I think that's why institutions like this one are tremendously important. And here, actually, I think there's been good movement. I mean, I think I know most of the leaders of the services, and I know General Milley pretty well too. And one of the things that strikes me is that they are very much committed to investment in the education of officers from the earliest stage of their careers all the way through. And I think that's what the country really does need. So part of this is a lot of high quality time in the schoolhouse.
So I'd like to take a question from our online audience today. And I typically don't identify who asked the question, but for your knowledge, sir, this comes from the USSOCOM commander. And I'm going to read it verbatim so I don't lose anything. But he says, first, many, many thanks for doing this. Your books are incredibly insightful and very useful. My question goes to your point about the use of SOF. You make the point in your book, quote, SOF have always offered politicians a seemingly precise, seemingly covert, and even deniable tool of military statecraft, end quote. His question, sir, is, could you provide your thoughts on SOF vis-a-vis China or in great power competition?
So, well, thank you for that. And thank you for being with us, General Clark. Part of what I'm going back to is something that interested me really at the beginning of my academic career, which was actually the first book I ever wrote, which is about how politicians view special operations forces. And I'd always been struck by the extent to which political leaders are just fascinated by special operators, and that's sometimes a good thing, and sometimes it's actually a counterproductive thing. I think, look, there are obviously certain technical areas where you know way, way, way more than I will ever know about where special operations forces have a role to play in our war plans, doing traditional kinds of stuff. You know, I mean, in the old days, I had a former student who was one of these people who'd been trained to drop into Eastern Europe with a small atom bomb strapped to his back to plant it somewhere where it could do some good. And I'm sure there's plenty of things of that nature. I think in terms of great power competition, though, and particularly competition with China, but also with Russia, there are going to be two main roles. One is special operations forces, I think, have been a very valuable tool of America's military diplomacy, of the strengthening of our alliances, of training local forces, and those kinds of things. And I think that role will continue. Now, I think I always thought it was a mistake for them to have that role partly because it distracts them from other things that they should be doing, but also because there are limits to what special operations forces can do as trainers and coaches for indigenous forces. I mean, you're not going to have, just because of the nature of the expertise you get, it probably should not be a special operator who's training somebody how to conduct brigade-sized operations, just because that's not what special operators themselves usually do. But that's a really important role. I think particularly in the context of conflict with what I've called the dangerous states, and above all Russia and Iran, there's also a very large potential role. I mean, one of the things I think we have taken for granted is that none of these conflicts will get really hot with Russia, with Iran. And I just, maybe that's so, and maybe reason will prevail, and it's not something either side has a real interest in seeing happen. But you know what? These things happen. And that's what history tells us. And if that's the case, then I suspect actually special forces would have a very large role to play if those conflicts kind of move from just being proxy conflict to something a little bit more intense.
Well, sir, since we're talking about the utility of special operations forces, I'd like to take another question from our online audience. And it reads, Dr. Cohen, will you please share with us your thoughts on the questions and imperatives of the moral or ethical utility of SOF in the context of today's and tomorrow's changing character of global geostrategic competition?
That's an interesting question. And I think the use of force under any circumstances is always intertwined with moral and ethical issues. That's a given. And I'm not sure that the moral and ethical dilemmas for special operations forces are that much larger, except in two cases. One is where you're really operating very directly against a political system, and to include one's own allies. And you're really manipulating somebody else's politics. To some extent, all use of force is about manipulating politics, but it can be particularly sensitive, I think, as you move into things which are, call it information warfare, or propaganda, or political warfare, things of that nature. There are areas where you have to be careful. I think the only one where I believe we actually moved to a kind of an interesting place without thinking about it has to do with targeted killing. The United States has conducted the largest program of some would call assassination, some would call targeted killing in the history of humanity. Literally thousands of people have been taken down by, sometimes by special operations forces, sometimes by things which are not special operations forces, but SOF have clearly played a very large role in that. And we haven't had any debate about that whatsoever. And it's not, and let me again be very clear, as far as I can see, the overwhelming majority of the people who were killed, the world is better off without them. And the collateral damage, including the killing of innocents, is less than usually happens, although it certainly happens. But it is passing something of a watershed. And I think we would be mistaken if we think that that won't come back to us in ways that we will find troubling. I mean, I think I would hate to say that we're moving into the golden age of assassination, but there's surely a lot more of that kind of thing going around. Just look at Alexei Navalny, one of Vladimir Putin's chief opponents, who's recovering in a German hospital from poisoning, which I guess was just reported as being Novichok. So in other words, almost certainly an official assassination attempt. We changed the rules already, and we'll see how we feel about that.
Yes, sir. Since we're talking about the moral and ethical utility of SOF, I would like to just put in a plug for the USSOCOM Commanders 2020 reading list. There are some very good books that we have already interviewed the authors of. So I highly recommend you go to the reading list, and we have a section that's called Ethics, Leadership, and Governance. In it, if you go to the JSAL library, you can not only check out the book, but you can also see the videos or the webinars that we've already conducted with some of these authors. And sir, if you'd like to, Dr. Dean Cohen, if you'd like to follow up with the person who asked this question, that comes from my boss, the JSAL president, Dr. Ike Wilson.
I saw that, and I was just about to say, hi, Ike, how are you?
Right. So anyways, I thought maybe you could follow up with that. But Sarah, I mentioned earlier that your book did come out 4 years ago. So I'm going to ask you now if since the writing of your book, have any of the global security conditions either possibly altered or reinforced your opinion about the use of hard power? So
again, a dangerous question to ask an author, because they're bound to say, well, of course, it just shows how completely right I was. I'll say there are really two big issues that I feel that I should have spent more time on, or that I didn't really address. One, which broadly speaking, I don't even think I saw coming, but neither did many other people, is the rise of populist authoritarian politics in liberal democracies. And it's, it's taking different forms in different places. But this does seem to me that this is not it's not isolated to any one country. It takes different forms in different countries. But this is a broad-based phenomenon. And the reason why it's important is one consequence of it in the United States, I think, has been to undermine the American commitment to an open world order, which I argue in the book still remains essential. And it's not that we will be displaced by another, world power, is we'll be displaced by nothing. And the chances of a much more chaotic world grow, I believe, to the extent that the United States doesn't try to play a very difficult and challenging role, which on the whole it's played pretty successfully ever since World War II. So that's one. The second thing, which again I touched on, I did not really touch on that one, and I should have if I could have looked into the future. The one which I also touch on, but I don't really get into enough, is the role of personalities. So, and there I think I am thinking particularly of China, Xi Jinping is a very different Chinese leader than any that we have seen since Mao Zedong. He is a lot more authoritarian. He is a lot more visibly and aggressively nationalistic. He is, I believe, in some ways, he's at least as ruthless as, say, Deng Xiaoping, but perhaps more so. And that's really challenging. It's really important for all of us to recall the importance of personalities. And particularly the leaders of great powers. And in Xi Jinping, we're up against somebody who's not only very formidable, but somebody who is quite willing, I think, to use force to advance Chinese interests. And that, coming with what's been a decades-long growth in Chinese military power, is going to make the world a more challenging place for us. If I could, I'd add one other thing, as long as I'm talking about that. This is also something that has changed since I wrote the book, and I actually finished writing it in 2015, of course. And that is that the American consensus on China has moved. It was moving back then, but it is now really moved. And there is, I think it is fair to say that there is a consensus across the parties, as divided as they are by everything else, and across the foreign policy elites who matter because those people who staff governments, that the Sino-American relationship is going to have very large elements of conflict in it, including strategic conflict. And that's a very big and consequential change.
Your comments actually dovetail with a comment from one of our online members, and I think you've answered it pretty well. But the member mentions that you dedicate an entire chapter to China, but you kind of relegate Russia to dangerous states, along with Iran, North Korea, and such. So you're saying that we're getting more emphasis on the relationship and possibly future competition, future conflict with China. But the question is about Russia. Why is Russia getting so much attention? And I'll read you a quote. It's from your book that the author mentioned. He says that Russia has a big appetite but weak teeth. So he's obviously read your book and would like to know, are we giving Russia too much attention these days and China not enough?
So thanks. It's always good to see somebody read the book. It's even better when they bought the book. The quote is from Otto von Bismarck talking about Austria-Hungary, which he the Germans were allied with, but he thought was a problem because, as he said, big appetite, weak teeth. I think that what makes Russia challenging is Vladimir. Again, it goes to personalities. I think Vladimir Putin is a very, very skilled operator. I think Western strategic thinkers consistently underestimated him. I have an exchange filed away with a good friend who's a very senior European strategic thinker who is not a softie by any means. He thought the Russian occupation of the Crimea was a disaster. They'd have to give it up. Russia would be completely isolated. It hasn't really worked out that way. If you look at what the Russians have done in Ukraine, if you look at what they've done in the Middle East, where they've been able, together with the Turks, to make themselves power brokers, you even look at their role in Libya, they're playing a weak hand extremely well, A. B, they are nothing if not strategic in how they make their military investments, where they put their money into, particularly things like advanced submarine technologies, which they've been doing. And I think the third thing is the Russians have always, even before the communists, even under the Tsar, but particularly under the communists, have been great at, let's call it political warfare. And that's certainly what they did against us in 2016. and presumably they're doing it again now. No, I don't want to give them too much credit. You know, I don't believe that, for example, that Donald Trump won because simply because the Russians wanted him to win in 2016. You know, the things that they do in that realm of kind of covert political influence and so on, it can only work if people are predisposed to believe it and predisposed to buy off on it. By the way, that's a point of a really interesting book by my colleague, Professor Thomas Ridd, about covert political action, that there can be a lot of it that goes around and it can have an impact, but it can only have an impact if people are ready to believe those things, so which indicates you've got a larger set of questions to deal with. So I do think it's important to take Russia seriously. I disagree in the book, and disagree even more now, with statements that Russia is the prime strategic opponent. It isn't. China is.
Right. Yes, sir. And your comments are very much in line with many of the other authors that we've interviewed on our Think JSOW program. They're all saying basically the same thing. But sure, we've been going for 40 minutes now, so I want to still save some time to talk about our current national security strategy. So I'm going to ask you one final question on your book, sir, and that's just, can you provide our USSOCOM audience what you think are the 3 biggest takeaways from your book?
Well, I think, I don't know if it'll come up with 3, it may be more like 4, but you know, the first is that this global role of the United States is to some extent one we choose, but it's in some ways forced upon the United States. And you know, it's very interesting if you look at Barack Obama and Donald Trump, both very, very different personalities, very different foreign policy outlooks in some ways, but both actually in some ways trying to pull the United States back from the world in a variety of ways, and both of them have found it very, very hard to do. And I think what that tells you is that the logic of American global engagement is extremely strong. And you know, you can throttle it up or down, you can make particular choices, but the logic is going to keep you engaged. I think second point that I would make is the critical need to think, to have different modes of strategic thought for the different challenges that we face. So you got to think one kind of way strategically about the Chinese and a different kind of way about Al-Qaeda, to take the most stark example. The third point, I guess, so I'll just make it 3, is the centrality of the American alliance system, which Special Operations Forces, as I've indicated, have a very large role in maintaining. If you think about what are, you know, part of what the book talks about is what are America's distinctive strategic strengths, and I would say that either at the top of the list or very close to the top of the list is the American alliance system, which is extraordinary and which we run the risk sometimes of taking for granted. And it has many different components, and some of these are kind of cold national interest things, but some of them are the web of human relationships which each and every member of this audience participates in making and sustaining. And I hope we never lose sight of that, because if we, you know, it's taken us a long, long time to build the alliance structure we have. You can destroy some parts of it pretty quickly. And once you do, rebuilding it is a matter of decades, and in some cases, it may even be impossible.
Well, sir, thank you very much for discussing your book. And as a reminder to our audience, the book is titled The Big Stick, which can be found at our library, or as Dr. Dean Cohen says, if you buy it, that would be great. But sir, I do want to shift gears now, and I'd like to talk about our current national security strategy. As you are fully aware, the concept of great power competition is now enshrined in the 2017 National Security Strategy, as well as the 2018 National Defense Strategy documents. And as I understand it, you're an advocate of actually getting rid of these documents or combining them into one and producing them in about every 5 to 7 year intervals. But I'd like to ask you, what do you think about the direction of US national security strategy? And do you believe we are returning or already back in a Cold War environment?
So there's several different questions, I think, packed into that. Let me try to take them one by one. First is, in the book, I'm quite skeptical of a lot of these foundational documents. Among other things, I know from my own time, the times I've been in government, but particularly when I was working as a counselor of the Department of State, I never heard anybody say, oh, dear me, let's look at the national security strategy and figure out what we're supposed to do next. There's an enormous amount of effort that goes into the writing of these things. And I think there is so much effort that goes into them that you want to, it's like any parent wants to believe the baby is a beautiful baby because it comes with a lot of grief and effort. But I don't think by and large they do a whole lot unless they are written in a way that captures a moment of strategic change. Now, to some extent, you can say that's what the 2017 national security strategy did. But basically what it was doing was capturing the fact that we basically should stop talking about a rising China, and we should talk about a China that has arrived. That's the big change. That's the really big change. And it didn't even fully capture that, I think. It was better on that than some other things. To the substance of the question, I think the Cold War analogy is not a good one. There is an ideological component to the competition between the United States and China. I mean, China wants a world which is organized in a different way than the United States. It wants one that is quite hierarchical, certainly in its region. It wants one in which human rights issues are ruled off the table whatsoever, in which China itself can get away with things like actions which are in some respects genocidal in terms of its weaker population. That's not the world that we want. So there's an ideological element. On the other hand, communism is a dead ideology. It is no longer a crusading ideology. If there is an ideological argument that the Chinese make, it's authoritarian efficiency. That's very different. I mean, the Russians never really made the argument for authoritarian efficiency because they were never a particularly efficient government. So I think in that respect, it's going to be quite different. It's also the case that the structural weaknesses of China are very different from the structural weaknesses of Russia and of the Soviet Union. At the end of the day, what brought the Soviet Union down was that it was a increasingly rickety system which did not deliver economically, which was corrupt and kind of falling apart and was anything but dynamic. And the United States put pressure on it, which was useful. But basically it sort of collapsed from within, and vindicating the containment strategy. China's a different case, and this is an economically dynamic society. It has its own huge internal problems, which we should be prepared to exploit in some cases, but it's going to be different. And the allies we're going to have are different, and we'll need to approach them in different ways than we did with the anti-Soviet alliance.
So, sir, then as an advocate of hard power, how would you explain the concept of proper employment of the U.S. armed forces in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I mean, that's such a huge question. Let's just focus on China for the moment. I mean, I do think, for the longest time, we have assumed our ability to project military power almost wherever we wanted to. And that is no longer a valid assumption. And in fact, it's quite clear that for us to be able to project power into the Western Pacific is going to be increasingly difficult. And I think that's just a fact we need to adjust to. I do think we, in some ways, need to have some very, in this respect, it is like the Cold War. You know, in the same way as we had a very focused strategic attention on the inter-German border during World War II, we probably are going to need a very focused strategic approach to Taiwan and to the South China Sea, because that, you know, those were the really dangerous cockpits of war. But I think beyond that, you know, I'll just say what I said before, is that the challenge is we're going to be, if you will, waging a whole bunch of parallel campaigns in different parts of the world using different kinds of force. And the problem is they won't be mutually reinforcing in some cases. And they will even, and again, something I talk about in the book, they will require different kinds of personalities. I think one of the things we discovered in Iraq and Afghanistan is not all generals are created equal. And, or more to the point, you know, some generals are good at one kind of war and some generals are good at a different kind of war. And our personnel system is going to have to get better at saying, this is the right kind of commander for this kind of conflict. And that really runs counter to a mentality that we evolved during World War II, which was essentially a notion of military leaders being interchangeable. And I think we've learned the hard way that they're not interchangeable.
Sir, my follow-on question, we've already touched on, especially when you responded to the SOCOM commander's question, but I'm going to combine my question with one from our online audience. I was going to ask you about how we employ SOF in this new great power competition strategy. And as I mentioned, you've sort of already touched on that. But the question from our online member is also about the NATO SOF community, basically asking the same thing. What is the applicability of NATO SOF within this current environment? So can you touch on either US SOF or NATO SOF in our new GPC strategy, please?
And obviously, you know, I'm not in the thick of what the war plans are, and there are undoubtedly particular kinds of missions that make sense. I do think, and this is a longstanding issue in the history of special operations forces, going back to Robert Rogers and the Rangers, you know, conducting raids into northern New York and Canada during the 7 Years' War. You know, the danger for SOF can be of trying to fight your own little war, you know, detached from a larger strategic context. And there's a very strong temptation, I think, sometimes from special operations forces to say to a political leader, in effect, we have the solution for this problem for you. And it's actually very rare that they can actually deliver the whole solution. They can deliver very effective instruments. And what I think is going to be more important in the future is how does SOF integrate itself with larger forces, which themselves will no longer look conventional the way they did in the past. You know, one of the things that's so striking, if you step back and kind of look at military organizations from 1940 through 2000 or so, they all look kind of much of a muchness. I mean, yes, an M1 tank is different than a Sherman, and there's different communications gear and so on, but you still had brigades, and they're still organized into battalions, and they have a certain number of tanks, and they have a mechanized infantry battalion as part of it, and so on and so forth. I think one of the things that's happening with conventional forces is they are going to look more like what we've thought of special operations forces being. That is to say, operating dispersed. A large part of what they're doing is bringing in external fires, whether it's from missiles or airplanes or space, or something. And so I won't be surprised if some of the difference blurs. And it will be, there are challenges, I think, for both sides in that. I think in the long run, the challenges are probably greater for special operations forces because, the question for them is existential. What's going to make us special? And I think that's a big intellectual question for special operations forces to think about going forward.
So, sir, in regards to this return to great power competition, and this comment in question is coming from, again, I don't think he'll mind me saying his name, but from Dr. Wilson, since you're an acquaintance of him. But the documents talk about a shift towards GPC or a pivot from something else. And using a basketball term, when you pivot, you're turning your back on that other person. So is that what we're doing in this shift or this pivot? The actual question is, what might this portend to the lingering danger of violent extremist organizations?
Well, I think I don't like the word pivot. I think one of the best and worst intellectual insults I've ever heard is somebody described somebody they didn't like as having a mind that swings on hinges. It's open or shut. It's 1, 0, or 1. And strategically, we're not in a binary world. I mean, what happens is old conflicts and old modes of warfare get layered on top of one another. It's not that the old ones have gone away. I mean, take one that we haven't actually had since 1945, nuclear war, which has its own logic and in some ways its own set of tools. That's still there, and that's actually coming back in some way. So I think the premise of your question, Ike, is absolutely right. It would be a mistake to think of it as a pivot. I also think that there's a real danger of forgetting some of the larger context that we've learned. And that actually, I'll tell you a story which illustrates that. So as I mentioned, I served on the Defense Policy Board. And at the beginning of 2004, I volunteered and actually eventually got Secretary Rumsfeld's blessing to conduct some research into American counterinsurgency doctrine. And one of the places I went to was Joint Special Operations University because I figured you guys would have something. Actually, I went to a number of places, and basically what struck me is the manuals, counter-guerrilla operations, all that sort of stuff, they were all Vietnam era manuals. I mean, down to basically how do you fight people wearing black pajamas and rice paddies? And, you then have the saga of the writing of the counterinsurgency manual that's sponsored by Generals Petraeus and Mattis. But I think there's a real lesson there, which will forget some of the intellectual capital. And it's, one of the functions of the different warfare communities has to be, each in their own ways, even while they're doing other things or they've been shifted to other missions, they have to be a little bit like medieval monks, keeping the art of writing alive during the Dark Ages. There are certain forms of conflict which may have kind of gone nascent or latent for a period of time, but can pop up again. And in that case, you need people with up-to-date expertise, not just in the technical skills of breaking down doors or conducting raids or something like that, but in terms of being able to think about it. And it's on the leaders, I would say, of places like Joint Special Operations University to make that clear, not only to the people in the institutions, but to the people outside the institutions, saying, look, it's our job to keep this set of tools that you don't need right now, or you don't think you need right now, in the best possible condition, up to date, so that when the time comes and you do need those tools, they're ready to go. I mean, I'll just give you one more example. The United States in World War II was really pretty good at military governance, taking over countries which have been devastated by war, and running them temporarily using a military structure for a time until you could transition to civilian authority. That expertise was thoroughly gone by the time we occupied Iraq and Afghanistan. That expertise had been, to the extent there were civil affairs units, there was in the reserves, they were non-high prestige in particular. There was a little bit in the active duty world. People had stopped thinking about those issues, to include creative things like, okay, if we want to run a city, we don't turn to the State Department to have some ambassador run a city. What you do is you bring into uniform some city manager from a difficult town in the United States. They may actually have some ideas about how you get, water and electricity going again. And we paid for that. We paid for not having up-to-date doctrine and up-to-date plans for a mission that nobody particularly liked and nobody thought we would ever do again. But it turns out we did.
Sir, I always like to ask our guests, I'd like to put them on the spot a little bit. I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball, and I'm going to say, sir, what do you think is the biggest threat to U.S. security in the next 10 to 20 years? Do you believe it's going to be a large state actor such as China or Russia, a rogue nuclear threat, a VEO, or something different such as a cyber threat or even climate change? So what, in your opinion, what is our biggest threat?
The thing that, if you were to ask the thing that worries me most, which is a somewhat different question, the thing that worries me most is the internal cohesion of the Republic. It is our consensus about our role in the world. It is the legitimacy of our institutions and the effectiveness of our institutions. We pay, when we respond to, say, coronavirus as poorly as we have, and we have, compared to many other countries, that actually weakens our national security in a number of ways, because part of why people partnered with the United States was, their view that, well, you may not like them, you may not approve of all the things they do, you may think some of the things they do are absurd, but boy, these people are competent. But more profoundly than that, I mean, there is now, I think, an absence of the consensus that you really do need to conduct effective foreign and national security policy. Now, the problem is there's nothing that anybody in uniform can do about that other than to, remain professional, do your job, maintain your allegiance to the Constitution, and all that. But I think it is unfortunately something we all have to be aware of. To kind of try to answer your question in a more conventional way, I do think the biggest thing right now is the rivalry with China. China is really, they are a multi-dimensional power. They have real weaknesses, and in the book, I caution against an exaggerated picture of Chinese strategic abilities. But the fact is, this is, could well end up being an economy that is larger than our own. We haven't dealt with that really since the beginning of the 19th century, when you're dealing with Brits, and Brits had a bigger GDP than we did. And against people who are sophisticated and who are hungry for national power, and who, by the way, have a history of miscalculating. And I wouldn't underestimate the significance of that.
Well, sir, thank you. You mentioned that the cohesion of the Republic is a national security threat. We're obviously in an election year. So I'd like to ask you then, if President Trump is reelected, do you see anything changing and in reference to our national security strategy? Or conversely, if former Vice President Biden is elected, do you see anything changes in our national security strategy?
So the first thing I'll say, which may be sound a little bit surprising, is actually in terms of the broad outlines, there would be less change from a Trump to a Biden administration than one might think. I mentioned before the bipartisan consensus on China. The Biden team, I don't think is really going to, I mean, they'll deal with it differently, but they're as wary of China as the Trump people are. More so they are wary of them on the human rights side, as well as, the kind of Huawei side and the military balance side. I think actually the Trump administration, the president himself, would be much more tempted to try to cut some sort of grand deal with China and sort of give up the confrontational part of it. But on the whole, I think there'd be consistency. The tone would be very different. It would be a lot more alliance friendly. But American leaders have been complaining about NATO burden sharing and so on for a long time. The Biden people would not be, other major things like the emerging partnership between the United States and India. That began under Bill Clinton, it continued under Bush, it continued under Obama, it continued under Trump, it'll continue under Biden. So in many ways, actually, I would expect more continuity than anybody would like to think, and particularly the real partisans on both sides. The big difference would be, I believe, would be in terms of organizational effectiveness. I mean, this administration has just done a terrible job of staffing itself with high quality, there have been exceptions, but basically they've done a terrible job of staffing themselves with high quality particularly civilian leaders at the deputy assistant secretary level on up. And we haven't paid, where you see yourself paying a penalty for that is in coronavirus. So imagine a kind of the national security equivalent of coronavirus, where you have fractured decision-making, you have, erratic decision-making, inconsistent decision-making, poor implementation. I think that would be the biggest difference. If a lot of this stuff is really boring, who really cares about deputy assistant secretaries and the undersecretary of defense for policy. But if anybody's been on the inside knows, that actually makes a big difference. If you're fully staffed and you have high quality people and you really do have a team that's working together, it makes a huge difference. That I think would be the biggest difference.
Thank you. Sir, I want to bring it back down a little bit now, and I would like to ask you about the professional military education system, and specifically JSOW. At JSOW, we're concerned about educating the soft enterprise to deal with the future security environment. Yeah. But as we've been discussing for the last 70 minutes or so, we're not really exactly sure what the future security environment is going to hold. So in your opinion, sir, how should JSOW and maybe even some of the other larger professional military education institutions prepare our future leaders? What would you suggest that we emphasize or that maybe we de-emphasize?
So I guess there are a number of things. Probably the most important thing is giving officers and not just officers, NCOs, a kind of a broad gauge view of the world. And you're not going to be able to predict the future. If somebody comes to you with a contract to hire a futurist, run in the other direction. Part of what you're trying to do is to educate people to be able to learn on their own, to learn quickly, to distinguish things that are true from things which are false, to ask the right questions about big strategic and policy issues. That's actually a kind of a liberal education. And so that's, I think, the spirit in which to go. Secondly, I do think, and this is self-interest on my part as a dean, but I believe in it, the importance of partnering with high quality civilian programs and institutions. I think we've I understand why our system grew up the way it did, but I think it's a mistake to have as much separation as we now have between the best parts of our civilian educational system and the military educational system, and for a whole bunch of reasons, including, I would say, the importance of military students spending time with people who are going to be their civilian counterparts. And that's really critical because they're not going to think the way you think. And vice versa, I would say. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I've always been delighted. We've had lots and lots of military students at SAIS, and we've had people who, 15 years later were working together in the Pentagon or on the NSC staff, and we're better off for it. I think it's also important that, one of the great things about the military is it does encourage continuing self-education. And that includes things like reading lists. And I'm grateful my book is on the Commandant's reading list. Getting people in the habit of reading widely. And I think Michael Howard had the great English military historian, had a great essay on this where he said, read widely. And I'll give you just one example. So it's obviously politically very incorrect to use the word crusades for obvious reasons. But actually the crusades are a really interesting set of conflicts, and there is some great scholarship now being produced on the crusades, which are very accessible. There are some really good writers out there, and there are all kinds of different interpretations. How much was this about religion? How strategic was this? Did they think in terms of 30-year conflicts, things like that? And reading that sort of thing expands your imagination and your intellectual reach. So at the same time that you're picking up all the skills that you need and that you're focused on the world as it is today, I think it's really important to help students get the tools so that they can then go off and read things which may seem tangential, but actually someday will be useful. Whenever I've had military students at SAIS, one thing I try to persuade them to do is to ignore most of the directives they get from their superiors about the courses that they should take and the particular things that they should be studying. They will do some of that, but I said, also just follow your nose and you will benefit from it. And you have no idea how you'll benefit from it. It could be a course on, the military history of the American Revolution. It could be anything. But, help students develop that habit of wide and curious reading. And that's probably the best investment that we can, this country can make in you.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Well, sir, before we wrap up, I'm going to take one final question from our online audience. I think it's a very interesting topic, but it has to do with China's relentless psychological warfare campaign against us and against other members in the world. What can we do to counter this? Are we countering it? Where are we succeeding? Where are we failing?
Well, the first thing is it's really important to maintain a sense of proportion about Chinese influence. I realize I'm sitting here drinking from what looks like a Chinese teacup. Actually, I got it in Taiwan, so don't worry about it. The tea inside is from Thailand, so I'm not actually a secret agent of Beijing. So let's just step back. Have the Chinese made themselves more or less popular in the world over the last decade? Answer is considerably less. Are European countries more or less likely to go to Huawei? Answer, less. Are the Australians whose economy is deeply linked to China's, in terms of raw materials and stuff like that, are they more in the hip pocket of China than they were 5 years ago? Absolutely not. I was just in Australia a year ago, And the level of concern about China in government circles was very, very high, and it was leading to actual behavior changes. So first thing is, let's have a bit of a sense of perspective. They're not actually being successful, and partly because of China's sense of its own place in the world, the mask and the ruthlessness of the Communist Party, the mask slips. And when it does, people don't like what they see. You know, you think of all those, wolf diplomats. That actually doesn't win you friends, and it doesn't win you support. Now, what the Chinese do have is a lot of money, and they spread it around. And it's something actually as a dean that I have to be very careful about. You want to engage them. You don't want to, we want good China experts. I think actually we're getting a lot better at that. I think I can tell you universities are much more sensitive on this. And it's not just that they're afraid that, you know, what happened at Harvard where the chairman of the chemistry department was taking money that he wasn't reporting from the 100 Talents or 1,000 Talents program. But in general, universities are now a lot warier than they were. You know, the best disinfectant is always sunshine. So I think as this stuff happens, you shine a light on it and you describe it. But I also think that, and this we have not done enough of, it's really important to highlight the difference in values between this country and its allies and the PRC. And that, you know, it shows up in quite poignant ways in Hong Kong, but also in Xinjiang, in Tibet, all along the Chinese periphery, and within China itself. And even when there's nothing you can do about it, it seems to me it's very important for the United States to be articulate and forceful in defending the things that it believes in and asserting their value. And I'll go back to our earlier discussion about my deepest concerns about our national security. You know, there are plenty of things wrong with the United States. There are plenty of dark chapters in American history. I think it's a good thing that we're facing up to many more of them than we used to. But I also think that it would be a terrible, terrible thing to do and would be historically incorrect and morally incorrect to just rewrite American history as, you know, just one of oppression and tragedy and, you know, essentially negative things. And it remains the country that my grandparents came to as immigrants, looking for a better future, where they got, and which their children and grandchildren benefited from. And, you know, we need to maintain our confidence in that view of ourselves and not be bashful about expressing it. Again, understanding limits that serving military personnel are under in that way, but you embody a lot of what's best about this country in your values and the things you stand for and the ways you behave. And that's also a critical part of national security.
Well, thank you, Dean Cohen. For our online audience members, if I was unable to get to one of your questions, I very much apologize. However, we are under some time constraints. But Dean Cohen, before we do officially sign off, I'd like to offer you an opportunity to provide any closing comments to our USSOCOM audience.
Well, the first is thank you for what you do. You know, like any citizen, I appreciate it. I suppose, you know, the way that I'm inclined to speak is as a teacher and thinking about students and thinking that, you know, really going back to what I said, something I said earlier, you know, this time that you have is precious. The military is unique in the amount of time that it gives those in it to learn, to think about their profession. I just urge you to use it wisely and to use it to cultivate lifelong habits of reflection and thinking, and above all, curiosity. I mean, you know, part of the problem of there's a lot that's very good about the very structured way we have of the military has of thinking about problems. I know that firsthand. So as my chief of staff is, actually he was a paratrooper, but spent a lot of time in special operations units. And he has been just wonderful as we get ourselves organized and do our own strategic planning in an academic context. And you really see the benefit of the kind of structured approach that is so characteristic of our military. But I think while holding on to that, for the world as it's going to be, what's going to be even more important and will be more important is curiosity, is kind of wide-eyed interest in what the hell is going on out there. And that's not easily translatable into the kind of cut and dried formulations that the military world tends to trade in. And I think one of the things that is distinctive about the special operations community, just because of the work that you do, is you know, by definition, you're willing to be a little bit less conventional. You're willing to be, you know, do some squirrely things and presumably have some squirrely thoughts. And that's really valuable. And I hope that you'll cultivate that mindset when you too have a seat at the table, because it's not just what you do in terms of your specialty, it's what you contribute to a larger operational and ultimately strategic discussion. So that's my concluding message. And thanks for hosting me, and I wish you all the best.
Well, thank you, Dean Cohen. Sir, in my opinion, I think your book does an exceptional job of explaining why American leaders must learn to use hard power in new ways and for new circumstances. If we fail to accept our role as guardian of a stable world, we're going to run the risk of unleashing disorder and violence on a global scale. So, sir, I want to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us today, especially on behalf of our JSOC president, Dr. Ike Wilson. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. And hi, Ike, and hi, Frankie.
For our online audience today, if you have any feedback on this session or any Think JSOC activity, or if you'd like to nominate a guest speaker, please contact us at thinkjsal@socom.mil. And as always, I'm going to close by encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOC collection by subscribing through the library, APAN, or on JSOC's social media sites, such as YouTube, where all of these videos are being loaded. As always, you can check out upcoming courses and events on the JSOC website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University. And once again, thanks everyone for attending this afternoon.